All right. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us virtually for today's discussion on EVs at Penn. I'm here from our Energy Forum on Penn's campus, an empty forum, unfortunately, where we usually or typically gather for lectures like these. Let me introduce myself. I'm Oscar Serpel. I'm the Associate Director of Academic Programming and Student Engagement at the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. And I'm also a somewhat exasperated owner of a Chevy Bolt. As if you've been keeping up with EV news recently, you might know that Chevy is in the midst of a major recall for Chevy Bolts because of battery fire risks, which is an unfortunate and unforeseen wrinkle, perhaps, in the transition to battery electric vehicles. We will see if we have maybe some time to talk about that in more detail. So before we get started, I would like to also note that this webinar is one of the first, if not the first event of Penn's Climate Week. If you haven't already done so, definitely check out the Climate Week website, which will I think we will post in the chat. There are all kinds of webinars, workshops, keynotes, kind of you name it, going on all throughout this week. So definitely check that out. And I find it very appropriate, actually, that one of the first events for Climate Week is about EVs. One of the most sort of substantial choices each of us can make to lower our carbon footprint is deciding on a more sustainable mode of day-to-day transportation. However, as we'll learn from our panelists, these choices are not always available to everyone, and a rapid transition to EVs will not only require constant improvement in the technology and affordability of vehicles, but it will also require major investments in infrastructure. And our discussion today will focus on how cities and indeed large urban campuses like ours can evolve and improve to allow for better access to low carbon transportation choices. Our event today is going to be structured with 3 short presentations by our panelists, followed by an audience Q&A. You may submit questions for the panelists at any time, but please note that questions should be posted in the Q&A section, not in the chat section. Feel free to discuss things in the chat, but just keep in mind that I will only be monitoring and pulling questions from the Q&A. And now let me introduce our panelists. Emily Shaw is a Master of Architecture candidate at Penn's Weitzman School of Design. While at Penn, Emily has been working with Penn Sustainability as a graduate sustainability intern, contributing to projects such as the soon-to-be-released Low Emission Vehicle Purchasing Guide, which they will be discussing later. Rob Graff was, until very recently, the manager of the Office of Energy and Climate Change Initiatives at the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. And in that capacity, Mr. Graff developed and guided initiatives to reduce energy use and greenhouse gas emissions and prepare the region for the long-term impacts of a changing climate. Lastly, FRANCA TRUBIANO is Associate Professor of Graduate Architecture and a registered architect with l'Ordre des Architectes du Québec. She is also a past Kleinman Center graduate grant recipient and has recently returned from a road trip to Canada completed entirely in an EV, which I thought was really great, kind of challenging the range anxiety that has really been a barrier to EV adoption for years. Okay, before I hand this off to our panelists, I just want to give a last reminder that we are recording this event, and the recording and slides will be available on our website tomorrow. Okay, so I want to start by turning things over to Emily, who will be discussing their work at Penn Sustainability and will provide us with really a kind of Penn-specific context within which the rest of our discussion today can be considered. So Emily, the floor is yours.
Awesome, thank you so much, Oscar. Okay, so thank you all for attending today. My name is Emily, and as you know, I'm a graduate sustainability intern at Penn Sustainability. And over the past year, I developed Penn's upcoming low emission vehicle purchasing guide in close partnership with Business Services, the Transportation Environmental Sustainability Advisory Committee, and Penn's various campus fleets, and our sustainability manager, Natalie Walker. So when considering fleet electrification, one of the main drivers has been the trends in Pennsylvania's electricity sources, as where the electricity that fuels Penn's vehicles come from has a considerable impact on the fleet's overall carbon footprint. So what we've seen is between 2004 and 2019, there's been an increase in renewable sources such as hydro, biomass, and wind power, while oil and fossil fuels have decreased. So as of early 2021, Penn's fleet has about 300 vehicles, 8% of which are 100% electric, 2% are gas electric hybrids, 13% are powered with biofuel, 56% run off gasoline, and 11% run off of diesel. And just as context, every 3 years, Penn reports to the Sustainability Tracking Assessment and Rating System, which is STARS. Our data is then compared to other universities through the Sustainability Campus Index to determine who is leading in each category. And in 2020, Penn was ranked 5th in transportation. So for comparison, Penn has an overall fleet, except with the exception of the University of Washington. And this is specifically for the top 4. And UW has 300 more vehicles than Penn, but has one central entity managing their fleet. In contrast, Penn's system is decentralized, which is important, meaning that each department is responsible for purchasing and managing their own vehicles, making changes like those shown with the University of Washington centralized fleet much more difficult to implement consistently across campus. So overall, Penn has lower percentages of electric vehicles, alternative vehicles, and hybrid vehicles, but has shown an upward trend in low emissions vehicles since the previous STARS submission in 2014. So the low emission purchasing guide is one of the main cross-campus fleet electrification projects that Penn Sustainability has been working on. When developing the guide, we knew that Penn's decentralized fleet management would be a challenge, as would the various functional needs that Penn's fleet has. We have everything basically from utility carts to specialized farm equipment. And prior to the creation of this guide, there was no universal guidance for purchasing vehicles here at Penn. So creating a precedent focused specifically on lowering emissions is pretty significant. So to develop this guide, we began with interviewing the largest fleets on campus. And from these findings, we derived a few key points. So firstly, most vehicles travel short distance in the city. So fuel economy isn't always the highest priority. Fleet purchasing and management is also decentralized, as I mentioned before. So funding is highly dependent on individual departments. So, and also there's no consistent access to information about sustainable purchasing practices and the funding options that exist for that. Additionally, most vehicles at Penn are kept for the life of the vehicle. So there are only about 20 new vehicles purchased per year across the entire university. And there are also precedents on campus already for electric or alternative fuel vehicles, such as battery electric utility carts and propane fueled vans and trucks. So we identified 2 main concerns over fleet electrification, and as you can guess, they are utility and cost. So in terms of utility, many fleets need highly specialized equipment, as I mentioned before, and there's also a concern over the type of specialized maintenance that's required for EVs, though our research shows that electric vehicles actually require less maintenance overall. And then for cost, because there is no system or university-wide system for funding, the budgets are per department. And most departments only purchase a couple of vehicles per year, if that. And so information about funding assistant options for low emissions vehicles isn't very accessible or well-known. And Penn's purchasing system is also based on bids, meaning the department has to go with the least expensive option unless significant justification can be given for a more expensive alternative. And lastly, because vehicles don't travel very many miles per trip, it takes nearly the life of the vehicle for the savings gained from reduced maintenance and lowered fuel costs to actually pay off. So despite their hurdles, there actually is a universal interest on campus in improving fuel efficiency and moving towards electrification. These are just, at this point, the main hurdles. So for context as to why this guide is important and has been created, in 2019, Philadelphia was rated as the 18th most air polluted city in the country by the American Lung Association. And so this impact upon local communities' health and the impact on Philadelphia environment, along with Penn's goal to become carbon neutral by 2042, has pushed our fleets towards electrification. And this is just one small way in which Penn can be a better neighbor to local communities. Additionally, based on the average prices of commercial electricity and gasoline, it costs about 4 times as much to power a gas-powered vehicle than it does to power an electric vehicle. So Reacting to the main gaps and concerns that we identified when looking into vehicle purchasing guides at peer universities and when interviewing Penn's fleets as they are now, we focused on a few main goals to developing the purchasing guide. So we wanted to provide a general understanding of the concepts and benefits of purchasing low emissions vehicles. We want to connect people with resources for funding. And we, most importantly, actually want to create a matrix of recommended vehicle options, including alternatives for vehicle classes whose needs are not actually currently met by the available low or zero emissions vehicles market. We also want to give a central location for information regarding the vehicle purchasing process at Penn, and provide information on infrastructure such as existing charging stations and other support, as well as Penn's new partnership with the Kleinman Mayor's Electric Vehicle Purchasing Collaborative, an organization that is focused on assisting with fleet electrification. So for some other programs and initiatives that Penn is currently working on, we have a few. So in alignment with Penn's Climate and Sustainability Action Plan 3.0, we have a goal to install 2 new EV charging stations per year. And recent projects related to this include installation of 8 new charging stations at the garages at Walnut and 38th and the Penn Museum in 2020. We also have plans of renovating the Chestnut and 34th Street garage to improve accessibility of electric vehicle stations to the public. And the garage at 40th and Walnut is the next potential site for EV charging station installation. And in general, plans for these new charging stations beyond 2023 are mostly contingent upon usage and demand. So having the Penn community actually having more demand for that is important. And EV drivers are also given priority parking prior to 10:30 a.m. So as previously mentioned, decentralization is a challenge to organizing Penn's fleets. So it has also posed a challenge for rigorous data collection and analysis of Penn's vehicle assets. We aim to better track and categorize vehicle assets in order to better understand the impact of energy types used. And our fleets are actually already also looking for ways to reduce their carbon footprint even prior to the creation of this guide, of course. So the university has been consistently purchasing battery-powered low-speed vehicles for facilities and other campus fleets. And Penn shuttles are dual fuel gas and propane, which has lowered emissions compared to purely gas-fueled shuttles. And Penn Transit also has plans of adding 3 new electric Ford Transit vans to their fleet. And of course, single passenger cars are not necessarily the only answer to reducing emissions related to transportation. So outside of EVs, Penn has several sustainable transportation related programs in place, such as Penn providing discounts to Penn students, faculty, and staff for public transportation. Students can purchase a Penn Pass, which offers discounted SEPTA fare. Faculty and staff can purchase trans passes and trail passes at a 10% discount. Penn buses are free to ride with a Penn ID card. And Penn also provides the evening shuttle running from 6 p.m. to 3 a.m. And then in terms of biking amenities, facilities provides an interactive map showing locations of bike paths, bike parking, and repair locations across campus. And the Penn Bike Commuter Expense Reimbursement Program actually offers $240 rebate for bike commuter expenses. And lastly, the Penn Home Ownership Services incentivizes Penn employers to live closer to campus by offering financial aid in home buying and home improvement, both to foster Penn's commitment to local neighborhood development and reduce the financial and environmental cost of commuting. So if you want to keep up on Penn's other sustainability initiatives, you can check out our website or email us or follow us on Instagram. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. And I'm going to ask you on behalf of everyone, do you know when this guide will be available and how people can access it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're hoping that it will be reviewed and finalized this week. But of course, as all things are, it's a little bit up to the reviewing committee. But we're hoping it'll be reviewed and finalized end of this week, and then we'll be posting on our Instagram when it's actually released, and it will be posted both as a PDF and as a web page on our website, which is sustainability.upenn.edu.
Great. And feel free to drop that link in the chat, Emily, if you'd like. Okay, so thank you so much, Emily. That was very, very helpful context, seeing a little bit about what Penn is already doing. And now we will move on to Rob Graff, who will give us a little bit more of a regional perspective and explore perhaps some of the costs and benefits of EV ownership. So Rob, I will pass it on to you.
Great. Oscar, can you confirm that you can hear me and see the screen?
Yes, I can confirm both.
All right, great. Well, good afternoon. No, it's good morning still, everyone. My name is Rob Graff. Until about a little over a week ago, I managed the Office of Energy and Climate Change Initiatives at the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. I have left that position to pursue positions at somewhere where that's more centrally focused on EVs and climate change than a regional transportation initiative. But I was there for 14 years, and some of what I'll be talking about, everything I've been talking about, I learned while I was there, and I will refer you to some of the great tools that I helped create while I was there as part of this. Most of my work has been on regional and municipal level electric vehicle work. I've focused this presentation on what could be done at a campus like Penn. I'm not deeply familiar with how vehicles are managed at Penn, but Emily has informed us a lot about that. So let me just move forward here. Just very quickly, for those who aren't available or don't know about EVs, I've got a couple slides with the briefest EV 101 you could possibly get. There's some language that's used somewhat inconsistently. There's generally a plug-in electric vehicle is anything that you plug in and add electricity to. Those are in order to drive. Those include all battery electric vehicles, also known as all electric vehicles. Then plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, which depending on how they're configured will run off of electricity for up to 50 miles, and this is like the Chevy Volt with a V, and then move to gasoline seamlessly. These are often very handy for people who commute, but also want to use the same vehicle for longer trips without having to stop at charging, enough to worry about charging. And then there's hybrid electric vehicles like the Prius that's been around for well over a decade, maybe even 20 years, I'm not sure, which essentially use a battery on board to capture braking energy to allow the vehicle to get a much higher gas mileage. And those are an excellent vehicle choice in saving, reducing emissions in a fleet. Then there's also fuel cell electric vehicles, which run on hydrogen fuel cells. Those are seemingly always a little bit in the future. There is not a public hydrogen. The nearest public hydrogen fueling station to Philadelphia is, I believe, somewhere in Connecticut, so it's not really relevant in our region. And then zero, although it might happen someday. And then there's zero emission vehicle, which is an overall term used to describe vehicles that have no emissions from the tailpipe. There's 3 different charging technologies known very creatively as level 1, level 2, and then fast. Level 1 charging is what you get from your outlet. Uses about what a powerful hairdryer uses, about 2 to 5 miles of range in an hour. Level 2 charging is what you often see in public. It's 240 volt, like what a dryer or an electric stove uses. It's about like having all your burners and your oven on full on your stove as far as how much electricity it uses. And it adds 10 to 20 miles of range for every hour that a vehicle is plugged in. DC fast charging is 480 volts or more and up to 120,000 watts. These are like use the same amount of energy as a commercial building uses, and depending on all kinds of things can add 60 or 80 miles of range in 20 minutes. So that's sort of the background on that. But note that a gasoline pump adds 250 miles of range per minute. So there is a big technology that there's a big technology to overcome in gasoline. Gasoline is, for better or worse, an amazing way to store energy in a moving vehicle. Where people charge, generally this pyramid is from the Department of Energy. Most people will charge at home using level 1 or level 2 charging. Employees at work generally use a level 1 or level 2 charging. Fleets often will use a level 1 or level 2 charging. And then in public, sort of around town, people will use generally level 2 charging. And then for driving between metropolitan areas, people will use DC fast charging. So you can see most people, like 90% or 80% of people charge at home or at work. Very few. Public charging is sort of a limited thing because of all the expenses that are required, which I'll briefly mention. And the EV world is changing really fast. There's a lot of new vehicles that are available, including pickup trucks, SUVs, commercial vans, as Emily noted, and battery density is increasing. Energy density, that's how much energy you can carry per pound, essentially. And the price is decreasing, and that allows both longer ranges and lower prices for the battery. One interesting trend that's happened in the last several years is that the electric vehicle market has often used that also to allow heavier vehicles, like an SUV will use a lot more energy per mile than a lightweight sedan. And also a lot of the EV manufacturers are moving towards more luxury vehicles because that's where they get their money, which is a little bit of a challenge. There may be more public funding coming, depending on what the Biden administration manages to get through the House and Senate. The total cost of ownership of electric vehicles is likely to flip to electric vehicles over the next few years. As Emily noted, one key issue is how much you drive, right? Because the capital costs of electric vehicles are generally higher, but the operation and maintenance costs are significantly lower. So if you don't drive a lot, you'll be less likely to save enough on the currently on the operation and maintenance to overcome the increased capital cost. There's also really interesting, used vehicles are starting to appear on the market. There hasn't been any really great analysis of how that's been uptaken, but it's happening. There's also a lot of opportunities in the goods movement world, that is freight movement in electric vehicles. One thing to note about electric vehicle research is that if it's in print, it may already be out of date. This world is changing very fast, so I'm sure as soon as Emily publishes this, she'll wish she could have changed chapter, plenty of text throughout it because it's changing very quickly. So for Penn, I just wanted to focus on two opportunities. One is in electrifying Penn's fleet, and the other is providing charging for faculty, staff, and students who require it. So let's touch on those one at a time. Electrifying Penn's fleet, there's a excellent resource that I put together on DVRPC's website called Electric Vehicle Resource Kit for Municipalities, and I'll try to remember to put Oscar, if you could remind me to put the URL on the chat after I present. It's focused for municipalities, but most of it applies generally to any fleet. And I sort of wish I had titled it Electric Vehicle Resource Kit for Fleets. It has a number of sections in it, including a significant, good EV 101s, a page on incorporating plug-in electric vehicles into a fleet, determining which vehicle to replace first with an electric vehicle, how to select your charging stations and where to place them, and resources, some of which I believe are available to universities from the state and federal government and from PICO as well to purchase electric vehicles and charging equipment, and then some contacts for assistance at actual names of people with their actual phone numbers and email addresses, individuals who can help you with some stuff. And then there's a number of plug-in electric vehicle and charging equipment case studies in there. So real briefly, one of the first things, and I know Emily has done this to some extent, is to evaluate your fleet. There's a great tool called the DRVE tool, dashboard for rapid vehicle electrification. The easiest way to find it is to Google that. It's a free Microsoft Excel-based tool. You can easily import an entire fleet using the vehicle identification numbers, which I'm sure Penn has a record of. And then it automatically sort of compares your current fleet with electric vehicle alternatives. It includes a financial and environmental analysis of light, medium, and heavy duty vehicle fleet procurements on a total cost of ownership basis. And it does a wheel-to-wells emissions for using the regional electric grid, because even though there's no tailpipe emissions from an electric vehicle, there are emissions associated with the electric grid that the vehicles draw on. In all cases, even in our grid in particular, is a significant lower emissions, and even in grids that are dominated by coal, there's still a advantage to electric vehicles because, as Emily noted, they're so much more efficient at turning energy into forward motion than an internal combustion engine. The key elements of a fleet analysis are just generally good fleet management in general, outside of electric vehicles even. Just, do you have the vehicles you need? Are you using them correctly? Are you overbuying? Are you holding your vehicles too long or long enough? And there's a lot of, as I noted, there's this dashboard for rapid vehicle electrification, but there's also some other tools on the Department of Energy's website, which I will also toss into the chat. Note though that electrification is not the only way to reduce emissions from Penn's fleet. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then there's a question of which vehicles to choose as a pilot. You really want to be the vehicle that you have to be a success. You want to have a vehicle that is not absolutely mission critical, at least for the first few vehicles, so you can, if you run into problems, you can troubleshoot them without causing disruption to the university's activities. You want to have a vehicle, as Emily noted, the more miles it drives, the more the savings currently. But for the first vehicle, it may not be quite as important. You want to just get one out there. You want to have a vehicle that's used regularly, one that is ideally highly visible to the public, so that both Penn students and those others in the Penn community can see that Penn is addressing this issue. So you probably want a vehicle that will be wrapped, with a wrap that says, Penn's electric vehicle, zero emissions, something like that. It's easiest to one that's parked at the same location overnight every day and at a building with an easy installation of a charger. Charging equipment itself doesn't cost very much, but the electrical work to get the electricity from the electric panel to the vehicle can be very expensive. And I would suggest that the siting of the vehicles at first be highly selected using with complete awareness of how much it will cost to get electricity to the vehicles. Also, we're talking here primarily about battery electric vehicles, but versus plug-in electric vehicles. I would lean toward a battery electric vehicle to get the experience that you need to learn how Penn employees, what's needed to make sure they plug in the vehicle when they're used, to get their reaction to how the vehicles work. This is not going to be, there will be certainly challenges in taking care of this at the start, but you'll learn a lot and you'll be prepared for the future. We have another tool, DVRPC has another tool called Planning for Electric Vehicles. This shows workplace, this is for Penn affiliated EV owners. So this shows regionally the demand for electric vehicle charging at work. The application itself gives lots of details about where this comes from. But you can see here that there's a lot of demand around the University of Pennsylvania for charging, for workplace charging, potentially. This is based on where people live who work at Penn and how likely people who live in those locations are to have electric vehicles. And this is a zoom into the Penn campus, and you can see that the redder the area, the more demand there's for electric vehicle charging. This particular map shows the demand for free charging. And this shows the demand if you charge the same for charging as people pay at home. And this shows how the demand decreases even further if you charge twice as much. Basically, it's the same principle as if you have candy in a vending machine versus a bowl, there'll be a lot less candy consumption because people have to pay for it. And just an example of how that works, I'm just focusing on this particular block group. The tool allows anyone to do this, plug in the block group, and then it talks about the workplace charging demand in that block group. So if I go to this detail, it will show that if we had free charging, you have about 8,000 kilowatt hours of demand per day and over 800 charging events per day. That's if you're giving it away. If you make it the same as at home, the demand for electricity drops basically in half because people will no longer, if they have to pay, they won't need it as much, which can save a lot in capital investment and land space for providing charging. And if you charge twice the cost of at home, the demand drops significantly, almost 1/10 of what it is if you're giving away charging, and the number of charging events drops way down as well to about 1/8 of what it would be. So this is something very important to consider in offering workplace charging. Giving away charging may simply displace home charging. So you may feel really good about giving away charging, but all you're doing is prevent people who would otherwise charge at home are now charging on Penn's dime, and they may be blocking chargers that people actually need who may not be able to charge at home. So that's another reason not to give away electricity. To be financially sustainable, any charging infrastructure should really charge enough to pay for itself, including the capital, operations, and maintenance. I don't think University of Pennsylvania is in the business of fueling vehicles in general. So, you have to be careful of how you build expectations for that. There's a lot of equity issues in providing chargers, as currently, at least, electric vehicle owners tend to be much higher income than people as a whole. And then a few final thoughts. I think this is my last slide. Electric vehicles are much cleaner, but they still take up space on the roads. They can still crash with bicycles and pedestrians. Like any private vehicle, they enable sprawl, and they're not fully environmentally benign in their manufacture or disposal. And also, it's important to remember that SEPTA's Market Frankfurt line and regional rail and increasing number of buses are also electric vehicles. I mean, that's the electric vehicle back when I used to go into the office that I would take every day, would be the Norristown High Speed line and the Market Frankfurt line. And then also, just a final thought that I had at the last minute, I wonder if there's some, seeing the types of vehicles that Emily was showing that are on Penn's campus, those small vehicles, whether there's opportunities to expand bicycles in Penn's fleet. And I think even more importantly, make sure they're actually included as part of Penn's fleet in any analysis. Another last point, which I didn't get a chance to write down here, is that the number of electric vehicles, which I know Emily had a slide on, is somehow less important than the distance driven and the emissions from the vehicle. So, you can have a lot of small electric vehicles, and that's great, but their relative emissions to what they would be if they were gas is maybe significantly not as important. So I believe that is all I've got. Thank you so much for that, and I'm ready to pass it back to Oscar. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Rob. That was really, really insightful, and I think perfectly added to what Emily provided, the context around Penn. Just quick reminder for you to post a couple of those links that you discussed into the chat.
Will do. Thanks.
All right, and now we will lastly turn to Dr. TRUBIANO to discuss a little bit about her background and context within cities and EVs charging in cities. And I'm hoping maybe share a few insights from her recent trip in an EV. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Oscar. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you sound
super.
good.
Okay, great. And can you see the first slide up?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Oscar. And thanks to all for participating. I'm just going to sort of start off by just saying a couple of things that are sort of suggestive of my position being a little bit different than the first two speakers that we heard today. I'll be speaking primarily about an AEV, so an all-electric vehicle experience. When I'll be using the term level 3, I'll be making reference to the fast DC charging. I just want to say that I'm an amateur in this space compared to the talks that we've just previously heard. And by this, I'll say that I'm an amateur, but I'm also a member of the Penn community, being a graduate faculty member. And I also live within 1 mile from the campus. So you might be saying, why am I talking about an all-electric vehicle if I live 1 mile from the campus? Given that I've basically walked to work or take public transport for the most instances in the city of Philadelphia, and to say that in the past 25 years, I've not commuted to work. I've typically lived within 1 mile or 2 from where I work. And at the same time, this EV experience has really been an investment for a vehicle that we haven't as a family made for the past 20 years. So not really being a typical user, I can still sort of speak to some experiences. And the first experience is that the EV experience I'll speak about today is literally a 500-mile journey, being the owner of a vehicle for basically 2 weeks. So we can speak about range rage more effectively in a minute. But let me just say that My sort of personal and professional interest in the subject stems from my own work as an architect, but also teaching architecture. And the journey began in 2007 when we designed and operated a fully solar powered home that was an off the grid home, which for the most part was an incredible learning experience. But of course, being off the grid and being entirely battery determined meant that in conditions such as this, where the grid is not available to you and you're basically relying on your battery alone, here we had some operational rage, I guess, concerns, because naturally, back in 2007, we were talking about homes that aspire to be fully grid free, but of course, not realistic. And just to say that this context of looking at our infrastructure, be it homes, cars, and understanding in what way we can sort of jump over this kind of carbonization problem is something that's been of interest to me for a while. And so I'm looking at it from a personal perspective, but also from a professional and academic perspective. When in 2018, Solarize Philly began to introduce opportunities for individual homeowners, even row home homeowners, to be able to be let's just say more, low consumptive in terms of their electric home use. My household jumped on this opportunity and we solarized our home. And this is our roof with 17 panels that maybe allow us to be a little bit less consumptive, certainly not independent in any way from the grid. These panels are grid tied, and in the sort of logic that we're using today, we are contributing excess power, as we're probably developing some today right now as we speak, and returning it to the grid in Philadelphia. But this story is more about our e-vehicle. And when we decided to take a 500-mile journey to Montreal, Canada, in Quebec, we learned a lot about the kind of limitations and opportunities that we have for cars and the context of cities and or regions relative to the question. So typically a 7-hour and 4-minute car ride, as I timed it this morning, as suggested by Google Maps, as one travels from Philadelphia to Montreal, really is speaking about a whole language and a whole culture that, of course, is still petroleum based, right? So when you Google, and I love the kind of gas sort of indicator up on the upper left. This is really for a typical time frame for cars that are still running gas. And of course, I can just say and report that if you are going to head in an all-electric vehicle across the border, this same distance would naturally take, not naturally, but takes 2 days and significantly more expensive. So there are lots of resources, thankfully, that are available to us, such as apps that make connecting and access to information much more abundant. So here you have, for instance, a PlugShare app that allows you to map your journey. As we mapped our journey, we were very excited because we looked and we said to ourselves, wow, this is an incredible sort of array on the left-hand side of charging stations. The charging stations are identified between Philadelphia and Montreal. They help you calculate your distances. And so in theory, one is supported on one's journey. What I've done is I've taken a snippet from the upper territory from Albany, New York, north. And what you see on the left-hand side as orange, typically meaning fast charging, by the time you actually zero in and look at the fast charging available to you from Albany North, you realize that they are few and far between. And sometimes even the ones that are labeled as fast charging in Upper New York State are actually proprietary fast charging, not available to everyone who may not have a Tesla. On the right-hand side, you can see that across the border from New York to Burlington, even Burlington, Vermont has significantly more fast charging than in the Adirondacks when you're heading up across towards the border. So when we are actually able to get access to an EVgo, for instance, this happens to be at the Vince Lombardi Service Center in Jersey, I can assure you that there's really only one, and hopefully no one is there trying to use that fast charger. To try to get a charge of 50% on a vehicle such as the one that we were using, we're looking at about an hour, which is fine. But you see that you hope that, first of all, it's not out of order, and two, that there isn't anyone else using this single lonely charger out there. But then, for instance, certain things that one has to confront is that even the superchargers that are identified on some of these apps are really exclusively proprietary. So if you're not running a Tesla, then you don't have access to them, even though these are in commercially identifiable locations. But thankfully, as we're crossing the border, then we enter into a territory such as the province of Quebec that has hydroelectric as part of a nationalized electric grid service. And this is where, apart from trying to identify the apps that are appropriate for now being in an entirely different country and province, once you've got your apps all in order, then basically your rage dissipates very quickly. And that's what we found, that as soon as we crossed the border, rage, road rage, or not road, but distance rage, range rage, basically dissipated, where you have these circuits electric that are located in markets, municipal parks, open to the public, next door to your in-laws, and even restaurants that you might be frequenting. So all this to say that thankfully on the way back down, we discovered that some commercial enterprises are becoming vastly more, I'd say, progressive in their ability to connect their customers with these kinds of services. Never thought that I'd be using those two terms together, but yes, we did take advantage of Walmart supercharging stations that are proprietary, agnostic, and almost anyone can use on the road. Yes, there are a great variety of apps, whether it's EVgo, Flow, Blink, or others that charge points that make it easy for people to get access to information. But the claim that I want to make today is that basically many of these are commercially centered, not policy determined, and hence leave the consumer with a lot of work to do on their own. And so if this is not part of your everyday activity, then it really becomes a kind of sort of lonely endeavor. So just to say that there are still persistent barriers to fast adoption of vehicles, lack of adequate fast charging, certainly in our region from Albany north. Where they exist, there are a limited number of stations with a higher risk of stations being out of order. Some of them, as I already said, are proprietary, such as the Tesla superchargers. And of course, private consumption targets such as hotels, restaurants, stores typically have level 2 charges and not level 3, for which you then need to spend more than just 1 hour or 2 hours. You're typically staying overnight. And of course, long distance trips can take twice as long and are many times more expensive. So what are some policy recommendations for better EV city living if you're going to actually need to be using your car at all? Well, certainly, cities, including the city of Philadelphia, might want to incentivize gas stations and business owners with surface parking to install fast chargers. Right now, as this map shows us, 80% of the supposed available charging stations just outside of Philadelphia are either proprietary, hence Tesla superchargers, so therefore not open to me that may not have a Tesla. They're also, many of them, behind private ownership. So they're in apartment complexes that I don't have access to, or in the case of the university, they're in for-pay university parking garages. The one solitary Blink station on Delaware Avenue that we use, I end up consuming 3% of my charge to get there, which of course is, terribly counterproductive. The city of Philadelphia no longer allows permitting residential e-chargers in Center City. This was a program that was started in 2007, was thereafter canceled in 2017, just when the market was starting to pick up. This allowed individuals who lived in row homes to basically be able to have a charging station in front of their door. It's interesting to me that we still allow curb cuts for individuals who'd like to have their drive-through into their row home. And those curb cuts are typically for petroleum-based cars. Yet, if I would like to install a level 2 charger in my home, it'll cost me $3,500. And I can't have an exclusive permit in front of my row home. And then, of course, as I just mentioned, the University of Pennsylvania really has most of their charging stations behind a paid for parking access. And in that case, they usually are level 2 charging, which means that if I arrive with a 30% charge and I am an employee and I've paid for that parking, I will need to stay there for about 6 to 8 hours a work day using up that level 2 charging, which means that no one else can be using it during that day, which is, kind of doesn't really make that much sense. especially since there are 2 and 3 of these on campus right now. So just to say, I'm kind of looking forward to EV innovators. And here I give you an example of hidden wireless technology that keeps buses moving in a rural Washington town of Wenatchee. This sort of kind of brilliant way of thinking about how we can recharge our e-fleets is sort of being seen as a kind of state of the art, but of course it's never in the Northeast, it's, you know, of course in the West. And then we have to cross the pond to recognize that why not make EV chargers required in the same way as my dryer charger, so that my panel is already designed to be able to take that extra level 2 charger. So in England, building codes are going to require this for all new homes. So these are just a few kind of ideas of how policy, which takes the onus a little bit off of me changing out all of my lighting, so that I'm not using incandescent, but I'm using fluorescent. It asks the question, what can kind of public bodies do to increase our access to EV charging? So that's what I have to offer today, and maybe this can contribute to our conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Franca. Okay, so we've gotten quite a few questions posted. There are just a few. I guess one of the major themes that's been going around in the Q&A is really how exactly the charging works in terms of who's charging you for the electricity, how is that determined, how much is the electricity, and this is certainly for me as a relatively new EV owner, something that has been a bit of a learning curve and somewhat surprising to me too, how expensive charging can be depending on where you choose to charge. And I guess this might be a question best suited for Emily. And I know, Emily, you've been answering some of these questions in the Q&A, but I wonder if you could maybe just reiterate for anyone who's not monitoring the Q&A there, which is kind of how is this handled on Penn's campus? What's the relationship between Penn's garages and Blink? And how does that kind of factor into the prices that are charged?
Yeah, so I won't claim to be an expert on the Penn garages, but from what I've gathered in terms of speaking to the different managing entities, basically the Penn garages are all managed by business services, and the Blink charging stations are also managed by business services. So while your charges for the stations go to Blink, the Penn garages themselves are like paying basically for the charging stations to be there. At this point, we just don't really have enough demand to justify reduced or free costs for the charging stations, from my understanding. And I mean, from a sustainability standpoint, at least at Penn Sustainability, our goal isn't necessarily to encourage single driver vehicles, but to encourage more mass transit projects. So that's where we're putting the bulk of our energy. So yeah,
sure.
That makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you raise a really important point, that it's really this kind of chicken or egg problem, right? Where no one wants to install more chargers than are required for the EVs, but no one feels like they can easily drive an EV without sufficient charging infrastructure. So it seems very unfortunate to hear about the permitting in Philadelphia for the level 2 charging was discontinued in 2017. And I wonder, Franca or Rob, whether you could shed any light on why that happened, or whether there's any hope of reversing that.
Yeah, well, I actually served on the I was the only non-Pennsylvania Philadelphia employee who served on the committee, the advisor group that worked on that policy change. And one of the big challenges is that EV charging is as much a parking issue as a charging issue. If there's no problem with parking, then there's not a problem with EV charging. And what was happening, you're shaking your head, Franca, you don't think that's the case. Well, what happened was we knew that people, it added about those places, people were getting private parking spaces in neighborhoods that may add a value of $100,000 or $200,000 to their house, and often not using the spaces during the day, and no one else could park there. Berkeley, California modeled their policy on Philadelphia's policy, and they had similar problems, and Berkeley reversed their policy as well. So this is not a Philadelphia East Coast problem. This is just, it's a problem with parking. And I would say, you know, in my role as a planner, that if you live in a place that has excellent public transportation, you really don't need, you shouldn't, and Philadelphia should not be giving away the right to park on the street, which essentially they do. I think the parking permit costs, I don't know, under $50 a year. I know the city of San Francisco had a policy. They didn't want any new on-street parking, whether they were electric vehicles or internal combustion vehicles, because really privately owned vehicles are a real problem in cities. They take up a lot of space. They they hit people, you know, so there's all kinds of issues. So the biggest challenge I think with electric vehicle charging for public, first of all, as I said, 90+% of people either charge at work or at home. Electricity is very inexpensive, you know, 8 or 9 cents a kilowatt hour. However, collecting the money for paying for the capital and paying for the revenue collection systems can be very expensive. In my township, Haverford Township, they put in a charging station at the municipal building. They allowed the public to use it. They pay $600 a year for the management of the networking and the credit card charging, and they had a total of $50 of revenue from that. So it was costing them $550 a year to provide charging that people were paying for. So it's a real challenge. There's no easy solution to it, because you want to provide charging to people who need it, but you don't want to provide charging for people who don't need it.
Right.
And it's a real challenge. And there's, you know, there are some options that we're looking into on allowing street poles, online, you know, having street light provide charging. However, there's not enough electricity in those systems to provide enough electricity to charge a vehicle. So that's an interesting challenge. You know, Europe has, most of Europe, including the UK, has 220 volt electricity, which makes it a lot easier than our systems, which have 110 volts. So it's a challenge that's being worked on very extensively. And I think another challenge is the equity issue, providing charging for people who are, you know, we've had people complain in certain municipalities that provided charging that, why aren't you providing, I can't afford an electric vehicle, you're not providing me with free gasoline, why should the town be using their resources for the wealthiest people? So that's another real big political challenge.
Yeah. Franca, did you want to jump in on that?
Oh, sorry, I thought I was, yeah. So I would just say this in the same way as the city will typically allow developers to make claims for projects that have ground floor parking, which I can look outside my window and see a number of my neighbors who develop properties with ground floor parking, where you would be driving right off the street. That requires a curb cut, and that automatically eliminates parking on the street. So in the same way as developers are given, and you know, private investors are given permits for curb cuts, which only kind of continues and propagates typically petroleum use, it seems counterintuitive to me that we wouldn't be giving someone a curb cut for reducing emissions in the city.
I guess I don't understand. This seems like a parking issue. I mean, you can easily have an electric vehicle in that garage just as easily as you know, I mean, in fact, it's easier to have an electric vehicle in that garage that you have the curb cut for than it is on the street. So if
I can just finish.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So what I was going to say is that notwithstanding that comment, the issue is that, you know, who has the right to gain access to an opportunity. And right now it seems to me that is uneven, right? So that's one. The other is that in the same way as the city had a really kind of innovative way of dealing with certain parking questions, and the idea of greening the city with parklets, in which certain businesses have been given permit and capacity to take over little space, you know, next to a coffee shop to be able to get a seating area. That reduces, again, a parking space for 95% of the time, a petroleum-based car. One can do the same on, maybe potentially every second block to be able to take one parking spot that has an e-charger. That e-charger could be used by 40 or 50 homes. And in fact, because we are, kind of app fortunate, it's really easy to identify when a car has finished charging and the car needs to get out and get a parking ticket if they don't, and someone else can come and fast charge. There are many, 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 many solutions. And I think that just having a conversation about how we can better our urban design solutions to create a space between private ownership or full kind of city policy. And that's, I think, where the invention is required. And that's where I think innovative cost solutions can come.
Yeah, I like your suggestion of using, there's a lot of off-street areas that are not used at night, like for instance, convenience stores, gas stations, and so forth, have a lot of opportunities to provide, to be a place where charging could be permitted. I just know that having talked to the city, they have lots of challenges providing charging on the street. For instance, I mean, and then, when you're talking about wireless charging, one of the challenges, we worked on that with SEPTA, and in urban area, that's a great solution for, as she's noted, a rural area or for a campus, but in urban areas, it's exceptionally challenging because of all the underground utilities and assets and sewers and wires, that it's almost impossible to get all the permits lined up to put those in. They're much more expensive than, you can do it at home. It's fine to do it at home or in a private parking lot, but putting it on the street is something that's does not work in urban areas. We've talked to all the major transit agencies about that. It just does not work.
All right. Well, that is our hour. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and I want to say a special thank you to our panelists for their time and insights. As mentioned and has been discussed in the chat, this presentation will be available on our website tomorrow, the recording. I will also ask the panelists if they could send me their slides, and we could maybe make those available as well. And lastly, just a quick note to any students who are on this webinar. I wanted to say that if you're interested in learning more about the Kleinman Center and our programming, for example, our grants, summer fellowships, certificate, we have our spring seminar for undergraduates. Definitely, I want to invite you to attend an office hour session that we're holding tomorrow at noon. I'm going to be on there, happy to talk with you about any of your interests. So visit our website, you can get more information for that. And want to just say have a great rest of your day and happy Climate Week to everyone. And thank you all again for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.